The story of Grendel begins with a legacy created by Hunter Rose. This legacy is passed down to Christine Spar, and then on to Brian Lee Sung, who indirectly hands it to Wiggins. From there, Grendel becomes more conceptual, as opposed to being an ethereal presence that overtakes an individual. This concept evolves as the series moves forward, and this legacy becomes the principle that dominates the world. Before getting into the comic book series, it might be worthwhile to briefly examine the overall nature of Grendel. Naturally, the name Grendel was taken from the ancient epic poem Beowulf. In that poem, Grendel is described as a descendant of Cain, the biblical character responsible for the first murder in human history. What's notable about Grendel is that there is a fair amount of scholarly debate concerning its actual appearance. That appearance ranging from it being a twisted, monstrous version of a human, to it being a dragon that walks upright on two legs. So the Grendel in Beowulf is an entity with an indistinct, possibly malleable appearance, usually shrouded in darkness, and a lineage that includes murder. This makes Grendel the ideal allusion to an ever-changing personification of aggression. According to the creator, Matt Wagner, the inspiration for Grendel was an amalgamation of sources. One inspiration was the novel Grendel by John Gardner. This was a sympathetic retelling of Beowulf from Grendel's point of view. The second inspiration was the Elric stories by Michael Moorcock. Elric is a classic anti-hero. He's moody and almost entirely amoral, yet he's very compelling as a character. These are the elements that would coalesce into a general interpretation of Grendel. It's an aggressive, amoral villain that is still somewhat sympathetic. There is a romantic idealism attached to characters of this nature. Being the anti-hero protagonist, they inspire a belief that they will somehow overcome their nature and be capable of elevating themselves above their base desires. In the end, they tragically surrender to their defining characteristic. In Grendel's case, it's always aggression, usually manifesting in a form of violence. The core Grendel series itself makes for one overall story. Chronologically, it is composed of the Devil by the Deed one-shot, the 40-issue series published by Comico, and the 10-issue Warchild miniseries published by Dark Horse. Much like the epic Cerebus series, Grendel has humble beginnings, but it greatly evolves as the series progresses. To be clear, Grendel is not an actual character. Grendel is the manifestation of aggression, and this aggression is personified by various characters throughout the 50-issue series. It materializes in a variety of ways, with some noticeable differences through each iteration. These are the basics of the concept of Grendel as it appears in the comic book. The first Grendel was Hunter Rose. Hunter Rose first appeared in Comico Primer No. 2, which is Matt Wagner's first published work. This first appearance, and the 3-issue black and white series that followed, are a bit rough and undeveloped. As a new, inexperienced creator, Wagner was finding his voice and trying out a concept that may not have been fully developed in his mind. Therefore, being overly critical of these early appearances would be unkind. Functionally, the first two issues are the origin of Hunter Rose and the antagonist, Argent. This black and white series abruptly ended with the third issue. The publishing company, Comico, decided to expand into color comics, and instead of rebooting Grendel in color, Matt Wagner decided to work on Mage instead. For years, these original black and white issues were difficult to acquire, but they were eventually reprinted by Dark Horse in 2007. This dispelled the rumor that Wagner was too embarrassed by his early work to allow it to be published again. This was not the case. These issues represent a story that could be considered a rough first draft. Wagner would refine the story and redraw it as a backup feature in Mage a few years later. So reprinting the black and white stories was unnecessary, since it had been rewritten and published as Devil by the Deed. Devil by the Deed is told entirely in text pieces, and with a panel design that is very Art Deco, as interpreted by the 80s. The narrative itself is presented as a journalistic investigation into the life of the notorious underworld character, Grendel, and the man that had taken that identity, Hunter Rose. Hunter Rose, appropriately enough, is an assumed identity by a young man originally named Eddie. Eddie was a highly intelligent child prodigy who was extremely proficient in fencing. He left his family quite early to live with Jocasta Rose, a woman more than twice his age. When Jocasta suddenly died, Eddie assumed her last name, Rose, and took the first name of Hunter. As we learn rather quickly, all of Hunter Rose's backstory is questionable. It could be, in fact, a work of fiction by Hunter Rose himself. The main source of this information, Hunter's journals, could be his attempt to enhance the myth of Grendel, rather than the actual truth behind his adventures and rise to power. Hunter Rose then becomes a best-selling author and a fixture in high society. However, Hunter has a sociopathic need to assert control and influence over others. To this end, he assumes the Grendel persona in order to secretly take over all of the criminal activity in the city. This leads him to come to the attention of Argent, the wolf that is sworn to protect the city. While the public struggle between Grendel and Argent begins, a private struggle develops between Hunter Rose and Argent. The basis of this struggle is the orphaned child Stacy Palumbo. For reasons that are not made clear in the story, both Argent and Hunter have an emotional attachment to this child. Hunter is in charge of her upbringing since he is a wealthy, influential author, but Argent is given access to Stacy whenever she requires it. This access comes to an abrupt end when Grendel publicly humiliates Argent. From that point forward, Stacy, who has become disgusted and repulsed by Argent, will have nothing to do with the Wolf Protector. Stacy subsequently learns that Hunter Rose is Grendel, the person who is directly responsible for the death of her uncle Barry, her prior guardian. This discovery leads Stacy to engineer a confrontation between Grendel and Argent, the two father figures in her life, whom she has learned to loathe. This confrontation leads to the rooftop discussion seen in the first two issues of the Black and White Grendel series. In Devil by the Deed, the discussion of their origins is not repeated. Instead, Grendel and Argent fight, and, in the end, Hunter Rose dies. Argent becomes paralyzed from the waist down. Following the death of Hunter Rose, Stacy is institutionalized. She becomes involved with her therapist, who manages to get her released. Upon release, Stacy and this therapist get married. During the honeymoon, the therapist brutally assaults Stacy before committing suicide. This results in a pregnancy, and the traumatized, nearly catatonic Stacy gives birth to the author of this journalistic piece about Hunter Rose, Christine Spar. Argent's backstory would be fleshed out even further in the 3-issue Silverback miniseries from 1989. It was plotted by Matt Wagner and then scripted and illustrated by William Messner Loebs. Unfortunately, unlike most of the Grendel series, this miniseries has never been reprinted due to the original printing plates being unusable. Briefly, Argent was formerly the Algonquin shaman, Dream Picker. He becomes possessed by the wolf, Maslin. From that point forward, his life's purpose is to punish evil. For centuries, Argent protects a frontier settlement as it evolves into the city where Grendel will first manifest. Notably, there are text pieces in place of a letter column. These are excerpts from a Grendel novel Matt Wagner was apparently writing, parts of which became the basis for the Silverback miniseries. In the final 2 issues, a text-only version of the rooftop conversation between Argent and Grendel is included. This conversation was an elaboration of the discussion in the first 2 issues of the Black and White series. In Devil by the Deed, Argent claims no such talk occurred. They fought in silence, and Hunter died. This miniseries contradicts Argent's official version of events. This miniseries also fills out Argent's relationship with Stacy Palumbo. It shows how it began and how they became emotionally attached. The life of Stacy Palumbo would be explored in the 2-issue miniseries from 1999, Devil Child. This story was written by the editor, Diana Schutz, and illustrated by Tim Sale. These 2 issues fill in the missing details of Devil by the Deed. It gives one a very good sense of Stacy and her motivations. Stacy had a lifetime of emotional damage by being in the presence of men who claimed to have her best interests in mind. Yet, they were monsters pretending to be father figures. They presented themselves as someone who would teach and guide her during vulnerable times. Then, when she was reliant on their presence, their evil intentions would manifest. These details are essential to understanding the sequence of events that conclude Devil by the Deed. Certainly, one can fully comprehend the story without them. However, with them, it gives the story an added resonance and a fuller context. Not only that, but it's a very powerful story on its own. One final detail concerning this short series. Stacy possesses Hunter's journals. At the end of this series, she passes them along to Christine Spar, who will use them to compile her journalistic piece about Hunter Rose. Metaphorically speaking, Stacy is responsible for passing this deadly legacy onto her daughter. Between these three works, Devil by the Deed, Silverback, and Devil Child, the core saga of Hunter Rose feels complete. Although there are many spaces available for further Hunter Rose stories. In fact, of all the iterations of Grendel, it's Hunter Rose that Wagner would return to from time to time, despite the character being dead. Hunter has appeared in a few one-shots, a crossover with Batman, and 4 different limited series. At a casual glance, Hunter Rose appears to be the version of Grendel Wagner has written about the most. This implies a certain affection for the character. This attachment is quite understandable. Hunter Rose not only began Wagner's comic book career, but there's also enough unexplored room inside the saga for further stories. Still, it's hard not to notice that Hunter Rose gets a disproportionate amount of attention from Wagner. Ironically, the only other Grendel that Wagner has returned to after their story was complete is the final iteration of the concept, the android Grendel Prime. So the Alpha and the Omega of Grendel have acquired the most focus from Wagner. Hunter Rose is given a lot of agency by the characters that assume the Grendel identity following his death. This influence is definitely present during the first 20 issues of the Color series. Those stories directly and indirectly tie into the legacy of Hunter Rose. As a character, Hunter seems to be the iteration that had the most control of the aggression that drove him. In fact, he rather enjoyed being Grendel, while those that followed were motivated by desperation and despair more than anything. These characters accepted the role out of necessity. This doesn't apply to Hunter. He didn't feel compelled to assume the identity. He chose to become Grendel. Then he manufactured the identity as an extension of himself. Hunter reveled in the power he felt and the fear he inspired while wearing the mask. Of course, Hunter was a sociopath, so that makes perfect character sense. Furthermore, his intense ability to control himself and others gave him strength. When he gives in to rage, when he lets that control slip, as he did with his battle with Argent, he loses and dies. Within that context, one could argue that Hunter Rose was the purest version of the Grendel personification. Thus the reason he is revered by subsequent Grendels. All things considered, one could conclude Hunter was the Grendel with the highest degree of self-deception. His journals told a version of the story he wanted others to know, and he believed he controlled the devil inside. As the concept of Grendel evolves, one can see this is not the case. At best, one could suggest Hunter was the one most comfortable with the integration of Grendel into himself. It was a complementary possession, one could say. Hunter's antagonist, Argent, is a nearly perfect foil. Hunter is suave and sophisticated, adored by high society, and feared by the criminal underworld. Argent is a misshapen, ugly beast. In actuality, he's a wolf in both appearance and nature. It's fair to suggest his presence is generally unwelcome in social circles due to his inhuman appearance. While Hunter Rose is well developed, he may not be as interesting as some that followed in his footsteps. More to the point, the concept of Grendel seems limited to the mask, the electric forks, and his violent criminal activity. The Hunter stories are a good study of a sociopath with the means to force his needs onto others. But as a Grendel iteration, those that take on Grendel out of desperation or other pressures are more compelling. However, one can't deny Hunter Rose is an important inspiration, and without him, the concept wouldn't have emerged and then evolved through the actions of those that followed. Near the conclusion of Mage, Comico asked Wagner to consider making Grendel an ongoing series. This was a bit of a challenge, since the character was dead. Wagner came up with the idea of a generational character, one where the Grendel persona would pass from person to person. This legacy would give him the ability to change the series whenever he felt it was necessary. He wouldn't be stuck with one set of characters in one setting. The series could evolve in whatever direction he felt like pursuing. Conceptually, it was a very strong premise to build on. Grendel would be similar to an infection. It could overcome anyone with certain exploitable traits. Additionally, Wagner made the choice not to illustrate the series. It was an unusual decision, since he had received a fair amount of praise and acclaim for Mage. However, he thought it was best to step aside and let another artist illustrate the story. As a result, Wagner asked the Panda brothers to handle the art chores. Wisely, Wagner didn't stray too far from the only Grendel character people were familiar with, Hunter Rose. He chose the indirect relative of Hunter to carry on the Grendel tradition. Thus, Christine Spar, the child of Stacy Palumbo, became Grendel. and her story is told within the first 12 issues of the ongoing Grendel series. Christine Spar was initially motivated to assume the Grendel persona as an act of desperation. Her child disappeared, and in order to discover what happened to him, Christine needed to adopt the Grendel persona and to utilize the equipment used by Hunter Rose. To her, these were nothing more than the tools necessary to rescue her son. Tragically, Christine discovers her son has been consumed by an ancient vampire, Tujiro. Under the guise of a touring kabuki dancer, he travels the world, claiming random young boys as his victims. To add to his evil resume, Tujiro was the head of an international slave ring. He planned on capturing and enslaving Christine's current lover, Brian Lee Sung. Understandably distraught over the death of her child, Christine becomes a focused, directed being of revenge. She channels all of her rage into one purpose, the destruction of Tujiro. It's here that Christine accepts the legacy of Hunter Rose. She acknowledges that it's hers to inherit. She accepts being Grendel. This leads to a confrontation between Christine and Tujiro. The battle ends with Tujiro's fate being ambiguous. Christine eludes the police after this battle, but she doesn't escape the suspicion that she's this newly emerged reincarnation of Grendel. Christine goes into hiding and puts Grendel behind her, believing it was only a necessary tactic to kill Tujiro. However, the police and the crippled Argent are relentless in their pursuit of this new Grendel. They continually pressure Christine and those around her, trying to get someone to admit that Christine is the new Grendel. The constant harassment forces Christine to become Grendel once again. She then goes after the police that won't leave her alone. Ultimately, this leads her to confront Argent, who seems intent on destroying all traces of Hunter Rose. This confrontation is fatal for both Christine and Argent. She dies, taking the life of Hunter's greatest opponent, Argent. All she leaves behind is a letter to Brian Lee Sung, informing him of the location of Hunter Rose's journals. With Christine Spar, we actually witness the transformation of a person into the Grendel persona. She begins relatively normal and well-adjusted, but events begin to spiral out of her control. And she adapts to this chaos by becoming Grendel. It directs her, it makes her feel powerful and in control. To her, Grendel is something she can turn on and then turn off when necessary. However, as the series progresses, we see this is not as true as Christine would like to believe. Christine is well defined as a character, and we're given a fair amount to empathize with as she begins her descent into the Grendel persona. It's easy to understand her motivations and the actions she takes. As the reader, you want her to become Grendel so she can get her revenge. Furthermore, she seems like she has the strength of character to keep herself from becoming an evil sociopath like Hunter Rose. Had Christine resisted the urge, the temptation that Grendel offered, and had she not bought into the idea that she was part of a legacy initiated by Hunter Rose, she might have survived much longer than she did. That's what makes her death so tragic. It was so unnecessary. There are two important elements introduced during the Christine Spar story. The first is the presence of vampires in this world. This element will eventually become very relevant later in the series. The second, more important element is the evolution of the idea that Grendel is not merely an identity. It is something more supernatural and intangible. That being said, Grendel is not very well defined as a concept at this point. It still has the appearance of an identity that's adopted, rather than an aggressive possession. With Christine, we see that Grendel is like a virus that can spread from person to person, if specific conditions are met. Otherwise it goes dormant and patiently waits. The Panda Brothers artwork on this 12-issue run is very well suited for the material. It is both unbelievably sexy and infinitely grotesque. It's an amazing contrast that's perfect to convey the idea of Grendel. That idea being, aggression or violence on a basic subconscious level is both attractive and sickening in equal measure. In fact, the artwork was so strong in conveying what was necessary in the story that the 9th issue is almost completely devoid of text. When Matt Wagner saw the artwork, he decided to add only 2 very concise captions to that issue, one on the first page and one on the final page. Anything else got in the way of the masterful artwork crafted by the Panda Brothers. This is just the first pairing of Matt Wagner and a perfectly suited artist or artists on the Grendel title. This series is littered with amazing talent at the beginning of their careers. Brian's story is the shortest arc in the entire Grendel series, clocking in at only 3 intense issues. Brian Lee Sung, who is stuck in the cramped environment of New York, finds himself working a lousy theater job. He spends his evenings reading the journals of Hunter Rose, trying to further understand what motivated the woman he loved to become the personification of evil. He also writes his own journal, detailing how much he hates everyone and everything. One evening he steals material from the theater and creates a homemade Grendel mask. He also steals a bow, and with the mask on and bow in hand, Brian goes to the park to unearth and read the journals of Hunter Rose. While there, he kills a mugger and almost kills an innocent witness. The police investigator, Wiggins, who had formerly pursued Christine Spar, pesters Brian, believing he has possession of Hunter's lost journals. Furthermore, he's convinced Brian is responsible for the murder in the park the previous evening. Brian decides Wiggins must die, and he begins to stalk him. Wiggins leads Brian to the park where the journals are being kept, and, while Brian internally struggles with the decision to kill this officer, Wiggins shoots Brian dead. Thus concludes the Brian Lee Sung chapter. The artwork provided by Bernie Moreau needs to be mentioned first. It perfectly captures the mood of the story and the mental state of the lead character. It is both tight and intense, and the environments feel claustrophobic. Also, the word balloons of irrelevant text litter the city, making the panels feel cluttered and busy. When the action takes place outside, it feels like a walk down a crowded city street. The entire style and pace is exquisite. There is a good argument to be made that Brian Lee Sung wasn't an actual Grendel. It may be accurate to suggest that his mental deterioration made him believe he was a Grendel, but he was never an actual Grendel host. There are a few reasons behind this interpretation. For one, Brian's mental state begins as questionable and rapidly deteriorates through the story. He is a person at a very low point in his life and getting even lower. He's searching for meaning in an utterly meaningless situation. Also, he's deeply obsessed with Christine Spar. This obsession eventually manifests as hallucinations of her. In essence, Brian is delusional. He makes a mask not to assume the persona of Grendel, but to feel closer to the woman he loved. It was an effort to understand Christine and to feel her presence once again. More to the point, Brian first puts the mask on to disguise himself while he reads Hunter's journals, not to commit an aggressive act. The murder he commits soon thereafter is merely a reflex action that instills within him a false sense of power. It's a power he attributes to Grendel, but if that were true, he would have killed the innocent witness to this murder. After all, Grendel would have no issue killing an innocent, but Brian would. While Brian claims in his journals not to have any memory of making the mask, that seems more like he's in denial of his mental state rather than the implication that Grendel made it for him. Also, in his journals, Brian discovers writing he claims is not his own, further implying that this is Grendel at work. Outside the panels, we see writing that seems to be the words of Grendel being projected at Brian, projected being the operative word here. All of this indicates that Brian is experiencing psychotic episodes brought on by the trauma of seeing Christine Spar die. What we are seeing is the fallout, the unintended consequences of Grendel on the lives it has touched. It is not an actual manifestation of Grendel. It is a coda to the Christine Spar saga. However, Matt Wagner's intention was to indicate that Brian was the most heroic Grendel host. He is the only one who rejects the temptation that Grendel offers. Although Wagner concedes, the narrative is vague enough to allow for interpretation. So these seemingly vague elements that can be interpreted as Brian not being a host also indicate he was an actual host, one that overcame the influence of Grendel. In a manner of speaking, this short arc contains a slight creative misstep in the evolution of Grendel. That would be Grendel manifesting with a voice. This voice appears to be a result of the collaboration with the artist, Bernie Moreau, who frequently populates his artwork with text as a background element. However, this was a choice made by Wagner, but it's not an element Wagner continues using. Although a muted version of this voice appears as narration in the issues that make up the incubation cycle, it is completely abandoned thereafter. Wisely, Wagner realized giving Grendel a voice didn't work. Grendel works better as a silent, intangible manifestation within people, rather than an entity with a concrete personality. With all that said, this arc is a precise character study that comes to an abrupt but satisfying conclusion. It's very intimate and self-contained. It defies expectation because one presumes they'll witness Brian develop as Grendel and then pursue a criminal arc of some variety. Yet, he does not. When Brian realizes he's being influenced by Grendel, he rejects this temptation. In the process, he is killed. With this story, the idea of Grendel being a legacy that passed from person to person had run its course. It became a predictable element. At this point, Wagner knew he had to shake things up to avoid creative stagnation. Notably, in an offhand remark made to Wagner, Bernie Moreau wondered if it was possible whether the Grendel entity could influence a group of people rather than one person. This idea stuck with Wagner, but he wouldn't expand upon that idea until the Incubation Years, when Grendel becomes a presence that takes over the entire world. Next, Matt Wagner stepped in to write and draw a 4-issue arc centered around the police officer, Wiggins. Wiggins is old, retired, and sitting on a sunlit beach, dictating stories about the original Grendel, Hunter Rose. Retroactively, these 4 issues are known as classics or devil tales. There are 2 stories, both 2 issues long, and they simply fill in a few indirect holes in the Hunter Rose story. In fact, Hunter himself barely appears in these stories. They're more about the effect of Grendel rather than about Hunter Rose himself. There's not a lot to be said about these 4 issues, to be honest. They feel a little like placeholder content, a way to continue the series while Matt Wagner worked out the next step in the evolution of Grendel. Chronologically, a short black and white story starring Wiggins appeared in A1 issue number 4 in 1989. This story, Devil's Whisper, was written by James Robinson and illustrated by Disraeli. It doesn't appear to have been reprinted. It shows Wiggins wearing the mask made by Brian Lee Sung and resisting the urge to kill in Grendel's name. The Incubation Years is a group of single-issue stories that bridge the gap between a somewhat modern setting into the distant future. The first story centers on Wiggins again. The presence of Grendel in his life turns him into a madman and ultimately a murderer. Grendel at this point has become a media darling, mostly through the stories written by Wiggins. Grendel is a commodity, consumed by the public. Grendel is going worldwide. It is evolving past its containment within a singular person. The second story moves forward in time and focuses on the corporation that holds the rights to the Grendel material. In essence, this corporation uses its influence to instigate World War III. It's heavily implied that Grendel manipulated the world into almost destroying itself. Through the media, Grendel has gone worldwide. The third story moves forward in time again, long after World War III. Grendel has become a tribal totem for those that survived the war. Another time shift happens in the fourth and final story of the Incubation Years. The church has re-established itself and has become the authority people look to in the Western world. Of course, an organized religion preaches goodness and holiness. This is in direct opposition to Grendel, a pervasive but intangible being that is perceived as a demonic spirit. The Incubation Years represent the final evolution of the Grendel concept. It establishes Grendel as an entity, not unlike the biblical Lucifer. One could argue that Grendel actually takes the place of Lucifer in the future, usurping the role of the ultimate nemesis. At the very least, Grendel is synonymous with the word devil. As previously mentioned, the narration for these issues is provided by Grendel. While it's a necessary device to get the story across, it's not used beyond this point. Giving Grendel a voice makes it too distinct. It locks the concept into a very specific interpretation. Wisely, Wagner abandoned this literary device right after the final issue of this arc. These batch of issues, both classics and the Incubation Years, announce that the Grendel series isn't a typical transfer of identity from one person to another. It's not a genetic trait, or a virus, or an infection. There's something else going on, but it's unclear what that something else might be. Critically speaking, these issues feel like a creator struggling to find a way to redefine the concept without a clear idea of what the final form might look like. Grendel does move forward through these vignettes, but in essence, it doesn't receive definition until the final chapter, after which the story moves in a bold, unexpected direction. Eppy Thatcher, the Grendel for the next story, God and the Devil, is an example of the Harlequin archetype. The Harlequin is a variation on the Fool. Classically speaking, the Fool reveals truth to those in power, usually in the form of a joke. The Harlequin is similar in manner, but he or she reveals truth to the masses. usually exposing corruption and lies by those in power. A modern example would be stand-up comedians, such as Lenny Bruce, George Carlin, and Bill Hicks. The Harlequin is an individual that appears to be chaos personified, or evil, or both. This is due to their motivations being unclear and at odds with whomever is in authority. Eppy Thatcher doesn't perfectly align with this definition. He's a merger of the Harlequin archetype and the Grendel persona. Still, there are enough similarities to make it worth mentioning. The end result of his activities are to sow chaos and to be the nemesis for the all-powerful, highly corrupt Catholic Church. According to Wagner, Grendel had been without a human host for roughly 500 years. During that time, it became somewhat insane due to isolation. Arguably, it also became more focused as it patiently waited for a proper host. So, some of Eppy's erratic behavior could be attributed to Grendel's state of being when it begins to influence him. The setting for this 10-part story takes place in the distant future, long after the Holocaust that occurred in the Incubation Years. It is the second Dark Age for humanity. The world is a wasteland, ravaged by the effects of a nuclear war. Regional tribalism is rampant. This is an era that is bleak and hopeless. The Catholic Church has risen once again in North America, and it is the reigning power in that part of the world. The Church is slightly kept in check by an oversight committee run by Orion Assante. Orion investigates the Church, trying to uncover evidence that the Church is abusing its power. While the Church prepares for an elaborate Easter celebration in Denver, Colorado, the outlawed avatar of Grendel appears and it begins to mess everything up. As the series progresses, it's discovered that the reigning pope is actually Tujiro, the ancient vampire that fought and killed Christine Spar. During his reign, Tujiro has been amassing funds to create a massive weapon that will blot out the sun. As this weapon is revealed and prepared to be fired, Orion Assante attacks the church with a mercenary army. Simultaneously, Grendel confronts his old enemy, the vampire, Pope Tujiro. This conflict ends with the weapon firing. It destroys Tujiro, Grendel, and a significant portion of the city. Denver is a wasteland. The church is in ruins. The only survivors seem to be a recently created army of vampires and Orion Assante. This is a very dense story with a lot of moving parts. The summary provided doesn't do justice to the complexity of the plot. Of all the stories in the Grendel cycle, this is Matt Wagner's most convoluted, epic arc, and he pulls it off very well. It's intriguing all the way through, with a variety of well-balanced elements that lead to a satisfying conclusion. Although the weapon to destroy the sun is not an ideal threat. But it's easy to overlook because the rest of the story is exceptionally strong. As one might expect, this is not a very flattering portrayal of the Catholic Church. In fact, it's a bit of a straw man in that respect. Wagner essentially utilized all of the historic examples of the Church abusing its power or indulging in the sins it allegedly opposes. He then puts this hypocrisy on display and highlights it. The Church is literally nothing but a corrupt, malicious organization, led by a vampire. There's not a lot of subtlety in its portrayal. It's quite a brutal study of a corrupt, influential organization at the height of its power. In contrast, Orion Assante is a member of a shadowy group of powerful people. This group is, in essence, protecting their assets rather than people. When it comes down to it, no one in the story has motives that are pure. It's just that some have motives that are less evil than others. For the record, Orion Assante is named after the Greek mythological figure Orion the Hunter. Naturally, this is a connection to the original Grendel, Hunter Rose. While Orion isn't the Grendel of this arc, this is foreshadowing that he will assume the role. In fact, this storyline also acts as Orion's transition into Grendel. Like Christine Spar, his descent is gradual, and we see it progress naturally. At the conclusion of this arc, just as Eppy and Tujiro meet their fate, Orion fully assumes the Grendel persona. There is a seamless transition from one avatar to another. One of the amazing technical achievements are the 3 parallel but complementary narratives being explored. There's Tujiro's scheme and the corrupt machinations of the Church. There's Eppy's public chaos and the exploration of his motives. And there's Orion's opposition to the Church on a corporate level, while he slowly becomes the next avatar of Grendel. All 3 weave through each other and coalesce together in the final issue. Put another way, Grendel's plot is grand, with many pieces to manipulate. Its presence is subtle and Machiavellian. It influences events, using a variety of methods to achieve its goal. Eppy causes chaos and discontent. Orion challenges the ruling force. The Church is stretched thin, trying to achieve its goal, while dealing with the outside pressures of Eppy and Orion. The players are all aware of one another, but not their individual capabilities or their end game. Of all the incarnations of Grendel, Eppy Thatcher seems to be the one with the most reason to adopt the persona. He's a highly intelligent outcast, addicted to a drug named Grendel. He feels betrayed by the omnipresence of the Church in his life. In fact, he's so deep into his hatred that he's not trying to take down the Church, he's trying to kill God. The Church is merely the avatar of God on this world, thus it needs to be ended. His entire existence is devoted to that cause, and like most highly motivated individuals, he's willing to die to achieve that goal. While his goal to kill God seems unachievable, from a practical perspective, it's one he's fully invested in. Of all the Grendels, Eppy has the most understandable direction or purpose. He's also the most ambitious. Arguably, one could suggest that Eppy begins the journey that Orion finishes. They are, in a manner of speaking, a continuation of one another. In fact, the transition between the two was seamless and simultaneous. One ended, and the other began immediately afterward. Their goals, while seemingly different, were two separate but related points in Grendel's ultimate goal. Destroy the ruling power, the Church, and then assume the power vacuum left in its absence. Orion was incapable of destroying the Church using the methods at his disposal. Eppy had no such limitations. However, once the Church was destroyed, Eppy had no capability to assume power and guide humanity. Therefore, Orion's experience placed him in the best position to carry Grendel's goal forward. In a way, Eppy also embodies how the Grendel persona has evolved over the years. It's no longer a simple, corrupting influence that amuses itself with petty crime or revenge. It's now a fully developed agent of chaos. In other words, Grendel has seen the bigger picture, and it wants to assert its place as the dominant force of the future. It will remove any and all obstacles in its way to achieve that goal. This is the perfect interpretation of a force of aggression, one that knows its full potential. It's patient, it's directed, it's Grendel. The Orion Assante arc, which concluded shortly before Comico went out of business, is a somewhat quiet but appropriate end to the series. Grendel becomes a motif used by Orion. He never wears a mask or wields traditional forked weapons like prior Grendels. He does use all the force at his disposal, though, and his focus never wavers from the ultimate goal, which is to consolidate his power and to take control of the world. This is, in essence, Grendel building an empire. During this story, all of Grendel's enemies are destroyed, and all that remains is for Grendel to become the leading authority in the affairs of humanity, which it does. Notably, due to his amazing success, Orion is the only Grendel that dies peacefully of old age. Like Hunter Rose's story, Orion's arc is told in documentary style. It is a fitting method to suggest the final evolution of the concept. The ending echoes the narrative style of the beginning. Furthermore, Orion, named after the Greek figure also known as the Hunter, mirrors the originator of the Grendel legacy, Hunter Rose. These connections provide a sense of closure to the journey of Grendel. The Grendel cycle, or circle of events, is complete. This part of the saga is actually split into two parts. The first part is Orion gaining power and establishing an empire. The second part is the vampires in North America being herded into and contained within the city of Las Vegas. The two stories do overlap or converge in places, but they are mostly independent of one another. Critically, it seemed like Wagner was building up to a street-level rebellion being waged by the vampires. But nothing actually comes of the vampire arc. They never become a threat or even a mild distraction for Orion. One has to speculate that Wagner would have done more with the vampires in subsequent arcs had Comico not gone out of business, putting the series on indefinite hiatus. When the series was revived at Dark Horse years later, this arc seems pointless in retrospect. It's not bad, but it doesn't really go anywhere. It stands out as a possible future subplot that was forgotten, and therefore it went unresolved. Like all the prior Grendels, Orion is a unique manifestation of the persona. It begins off subtle and slowly shows itself through sociopathic obsession. One could argue that, ultimately, Grendel's final evolution is to be a force for good, despite its destructive nature. While tentative at best, the world is united, and humanity is at a point where it can overcome the challenges that have historically impeded its progress forward. Of course, it's hard to ignore that Orion's empire is a totalitarian, fascist regime, not unlike the Roman Empire. So whether this final development is good or not, or whether it will last long enough to effect a positive change in humanity, is open to debate. Also, one can't overlook the possibility that this appearance of good is an accidental consequence of a self-serving goal. As suggested earlier, the final issue of the Comico series is an appropriate end to the saga. It feels like a quiet but grand finale to a series that evolved well beyond its simple crime origins. Quite simply, Grendel's goal has been achieved. In Grendel number 34, Wagner did announce the series was coming to a close with the 40th issue. This may account for the sense of completeness this arc represents. It was intended to be an ending of sorts. Although Wagner does imply there may be future developments after this conclusion. One specific development was the Grendel Tales series, which debuted in the final issue of the Comico run. Wagner was going to end the main Grendel title and to allow others to write stories within the world he had created. Presumably, once Wagner had a new direction, he would return to the series. Until that time, other creative teams would keep the Grendel brand going. That appears to be the plan as this final arc began. As mentioned in the final issue, another story occurred to Wagner as this closing arc was being produced. Unfortunately, Wagner was writing and illustrating the Grendel and Batman crossover, so his time was limited. He had to postpone any Grendel plans until he completed this limited series, thus the publication delay. During this announced 5-month delay, Comico went out of business. All future plans for Grendel, Grendel Tales, and the Grendel and Batman crossover were put on hold. It would take 2 years before the publishing rights to both Mage and Grendel were legally sorted out, after which the series took up residence at Dark Horse Comics. The final series in the original run is Grendel, War Child. This 10-issue series was published in 1992 by Dark Horse Comics. It features Orion Assante's son, Jupiter, and the cyborg, Grendel Prime. Critically speaking, War Child is a long coda to the Orion Assante story. It introduces the cyborg, Grendel Prime, who kidnaps Orion's son, Jupiter, in order to protect the developing future Grendel. The bulk of the series is an extended chase scene and, in the end, it doesn't really add anything to the Grendel mythos. It simply reiterates what has already been established, namely, that the world is now Grendel's. At best, Warchild restates the genius of Orion Assante. He had the foresight to literally give birth to the heir to his empire. Then he secretly constructed a cyborg to protect the child that would rule the world Orion had established. Conceptually, it's not a bad idea, but the actual series could have been effectively done in about 4 issues. From this point forward, Matt Wagner stepped aside from the series. As originally planned at Comico, Grendel Tales began when he was done. This led to Dark Horse publishing a variety of miniseries over the next 4 years. Within the first batch of miniseries, Matt Wagner did write and illustrate a Grendel Prime backup feature that tied directly into the 1996 miniseries Batman Grendel 2. In this backup feature, and the subsequent tie-in miniseries, Grendel Prime travels back in time to retrieve the skull of Hunter Rose. Presumably, this mission would lead to further Grendel adventures centered around the skull, but that never came to pass. Or it was a false direction, to indicate that the revered Hunter Rose was not a special Grendel. That is, he didn't originate the concept. It existed long before him, and it will carry on long after his death. Following the end of this miniseries, Wagner did not return to the future Grendel-controlled world. All the subsequent Grendel-related material starred Hunter Rose. This changed in 2019 with the publication of Devil's Odyssey. This 8-part story appears to be another, possibly final evolution of Grendel. The cyborg, Grendel Prime, takes to the stars to establish humanity and Grendel on other worlds. Unfortunately, due to the global pandemic, the series was put on hold after the 4th issue. More issues were solicited, but then cancelled. At the time of this writing, early 2021, they have yet to be rescheduled. Regardless, the idea of Grendel Prime, taking the DNA of Orion Assante to another world to establish a pure, Grendel-based society is a highly appropriate concept. It seems like a solid manner to, once again, to evolve the concept one step further, and to establish a premise where more stories can be explored, or to give the series a sense of closure, which is likely its intent. The legacy Wagner leaves behind, should Devil's Odyssey be the final Grendel story, is a long mediation on the nature of aggression and how it manifests in a variety of ways. It can be a guiding force, providing a clarity of vision, or it can be a negative force, inspiring violence and causing death and destruction. Overall, it can be subtle, and its influence may not be obvious. It has existed since the beginning of time, and it's something we will carry with us to the stars. It may be a vital part of the human spirit, and, finally, it may be the legacy we leave behind for the universe to discover.